All right, on to the next piece, interpreting interactions. That's what I really want to get at here. Within this design, we also get an interaction. We get those two main effects, and then we get an interaction. The interaction is that combination effect. And what we're trying to get at here is, for example, does playing a violent game while being frustrated produce more aggression than playing a violent game when not being frustrated? That's probably the most logical idea to come out of this. Again, does violent video game play cause aggression? Well, it depends. It depends on what's going on, frustration being a proxy for that here. So again, in interpreting these different effects for the main effect of factor A, we're going to focus on whether the means for the different levels of factor A differ. For the main effect of factor B, we're going to focus on whether the means of the levels of factor B differ. For the interaction, we can ask this in a number of different ways. Is the effect of A similar at each level of B? Or we could do it the other way around, whichever makes most sense to you. That is the difference between A1 and A2 the same when we're talking about B1 or versus B2? Or we could flip that around. So we're going to ask those questions of each of these graphs. Oops. So here's a graph where we have a couple of different mean values. One thing we can see is that the mean for the non-violent games and the mean for the violent games, both 7.5. So we don't have a main effect there in terms of whether there's a difference between those types of games. We do have a difference between the frustrated and the not frustrated conditions. For the frustrated conditions, there's a mean of 10. For the not frustrated conditions, there's a mean of 5. What does that mean? Well, it means that we do have a main effect for frustration. At least graphically, we have a main effect for frustration. We'll test this formally in a little bit, but I want to cement the concepts first. The mean for frustration is higher than the mean for not frustrated. Is there an interaction? Well, here's where we're going to ask, do frustrated and not frustrated show the same pattern for non-violent games versus violent games? 5-point difference in the one in favoring frustrated. For non-violent games, same thing for violent games. So we see the same pattern, and when we see that same pattern, we have no interaction, and we can go ahead and be free to say it's frustration that makes a difference here. And that's just what this says. We have a main effect for frustration level. Here's another one. Here's one where we see that the violent games consistently produced more aggression than the non-violent games. The means for the frustration conditions were the same, and the effect of being frustrated versus not frustrated for non-violent games versus violent games was exactly the same. So here we'd say we have a main effect for video game type, but no main effect for frustration and no interaction. All right, what do we got here? So here we have violent games with a higher mean than non-violent games. The right side consistently has a higher mean than the left side. We also see that blue is always larger than red. The right ones in each pair are larger than the ones on the left in each pair. So we have a main effect for frustration. Do we have an interaction though? Here's where we really need to dig a little bit deeper. Do we have an interaction? Well, we want to ask, okay, what's the difference between violent and non-violent what's the difference between frustrated and not frustrated for the non-violent games? It's a 5-point difference, 5 and 10. For the violent games, it's also a 5-point difference, 5 and 10. That's the same effect on both sides. So we would say we have no interaction in this case. So 2 main effects, no interaction. In this case, we see basically an additive effect. The violent games produce some jump in aggression, then the frustration produces some jump in aggression, and together they produce a cumulative effect. All right, what do we have here? We have all of the means being the same. When all of the means are being the same, you know, well, 3 things, maybe a 4th thing. The first thing is that there's no main effect for the type of video game. There's no main effect for frustration condition, and there is no interaction. Another thing you might infer is that this might be an experiment that I personally designed, because none of my experiments ever seem to come out with anything. So no main effects, no interactions here. All right, maybe we'll find one with an interaction soon. Here we go. Here's an interesting one, one that's relatively common. This is an interaction effect where we have no main effects. We can see that violent and non-violent match at 7, frustrated and not 7.5, frustrated and not frustrated match at 7.5. However, the effect on the left-hand side and the effect on the right-hand side are completely different. For non-violent games, for some reason, when people are not frustrated, they're more aggressive. For violent games, the pattern is reversed. This is sometimes called a crossover interaction. And we used to use line graphs to represent these, and they make an X. And that always makes me want to do this now. Wakanda forever. All right, so here we have a situation with an interaction and no main effects. All right, here's one. It's probably the most plausible one. We have a situation here where we have higher means for violent games and higher overall means for the frustrated conditions. But all of the bars are the same except for one of them. There's something very different going on for violent games versus non-violent games. What is this showing us? Well, it's not that it's a violent game. It's not that the person's frustrated. It's that combination effect of the two. The combination of playing a violent game while being frustrated is what's driving this interaction. But it's not just driving the interaction. That big high score of 15 is driving those main effects. So we often say in situations like this, yeah, they're main effects, but they're qualified by the interaction, meaning that that interaction is just a mathematical byproduct of the fact that the interaction is so strong. So in cases like that, we definitely temper our conclusions and say, no, don't look at those main effects as anything important. It's not those things individually. That's just a product of the combination being so strong. All right, one more here. Here's a situation where we have a couple of interesting things going on. We have statistical main effects, meaning that we've got differences between the means for nonviolent and violent and frustrated and not frustrated. We also have an interaction. You can see on the left, there's no difference between nonviolent and frustrated. On the right, we do have a difference between nonviolent and frustrated. This is an interaction, but it suggests something different about the main effects. First, if we look at the type of video game, a good question to ask is, are the violent video games always higher? Are they higher when there's no frustration? Yes. Are they higher when there is frustration? Yes, they're a lot higher, but they're also higher. When we have that consistency, then we do have a main effect that we should be talking about. You know, overall, violent video games are causing more aggression. They really ramp up the aggression when they're paired with frustration, as before. Another thing to note here, though, for the frustration conditions, again, we want to ask that question: is frustrated always bigger than not frustrated? If it is, we can be very confident in saying we have an actual main effect, not just a statistical artifact of that interaction. If it isn't, then we want to say, well, you know, that's just a product of the interaction. Here we see on the left, the frustration doesn't make any difference. On the right, it does. So there, even though we have a statistical main effect, we want to say, yeah, hold off, that's just there because of the interaction. All right, last one, kind of reversed in this pattern. Again, we have something very similar. An interaction wherein frustration makes you more aggressive and paired with the non-violent games. Violent games, whether it's frustrated or not frustrated, you still get that effect. So what this would suggest is that excuse me, this would suggest that we have just that interaction, that the combination, that either being frustrated or playing violent video games always produces a lot of aggression. The only time it doesn't is when you see that paired against it.
Violent video games do not prove aggression.
The peanut gallery telling me that violent video games don't cause aggression. Anyway, let's take a look at another one. This is a 2x3 factorial design from an old study that I did years back. In this study, this was a questionnaire where participants rated a candidate for an HIV/AIDS education program. There were 6 different versions of the questionnaire. There were 2 factors. We modified in a fake resume the sexual orientation of the applicant. There was a personal statement, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we modified the applicant qualifications. We had applicants who were either highly qualified, moderately qualified, or not at all qualified. In terms of the manipulation of sexual orientation, I became involved, the heterosexual applicant, they talked about, they were all male applicants. They talked about becoming involved when an ex-girlfriend called and told me she had HIV. Of course, having an old girlfriend does not mean that the male would necessarily be heterosexual, but that's how they were perceived. And in the gay applicant position, I became involved in HIV education when an ex-boyfriend told me he was HIV. Okay, for the manipulation of qualifications, highly qualified applicants had experience as an assistant AIDS education coordinator, where they prepared educational material, taught occasional courses, and provided referrals for testing. This was basically their qualifications perfectly matched those in the job ad. The ambiguously qualified, they had been an AIDS education volunteer, just not a lot of information. It wasn't clear whether they were qualified or not. And, and a not qualified person, the only thing they had done is they had handed out condoms on Valentine's Day. Now, we had measures of qualification ratings and measures of recommendations that we'll take a look at. The hypothesis here was that orientation doesn't matter except when qualifications are ambiguous. When we interpret ambiguous stimuli, that's when biases come out. According to what's called the aversive racism paradigm, which is what we were applying here, when it's obvious what people should do or how people should act or respond to somebody, they generally do not, they generally do not show bias, because it would be obvious that they were biased if they were doing so. However, when the situation is unclear, that's when we see biases come out. And so we were expecting that there would only be biases under ambiguous stimuli. All right, and we did all kinds of experimental shenanigans to make sure that people were perceiving the participants as we expected them to. We tested the materials, and that was all came out verified. In terms of the ratings, we see that overall qualifications mattered. That didn't really interest us. We knew that would be the case. It's not an interesting question. Overall, the difference between the blue and the red bars. The difference between the blue and the red bars was, they're not very big. Overall, those differences kind of washed out. So no real difference between heterosexual and gay participants overall. Again, not our interest. Our interest was whether we had that interaction effect. We see for not qualified, there's really no difference between the ratings. For ambiguously qualified, the heterosexual applicants were rated much more highly. And for highly qualified, again, we see practically the same ratings. So what we had here was an interaction. And again, that's exactly what we expect. Again, like most psychological theories, that we have an it depends thing going on. It depends what, whether orientation matters. For hiring recommendation, we had something similar, of course. Qualifications mattered. That is not surprising and not at all interesting. Orientation didn't really matter overall. I think they were almost completely perfect. Well, while we found something interesting, under ambiguous qualifications, we had that same pattern with the heterosexual applicant getting, please stop climbing in here. We had that pattern with heterosexual applicants getting better ratings. However, when we had the highly qualified applicants, I think the perception of being stigmatized as being biased was so strong that it led to 100% of the participants recommending the gay applicant versus the heterosexual applicant. There may be other stuff in there. There may be perceptions that HIV/AIDS is more of a problem for the gay male community. Whatever, there was something else going on in there. So we see a different kind of interaction though. That's kind of reversed. It's like almost a crossover interaction with those last two pieces.